Have you ever just stood still in a forest, silently listening, and kind of felt like you've entered in some kind of magical or sacred place? Have the trees seemed to come alive simply by the wind or maybe by resonance? And you felt that you wanted to connect, reach out, and maybe even hug a tree? After discovering the book, The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, I realized that there's a reason trees had always seemed to speak to me. There's a whole world in the woods that I ignored, that I desperately wanted to know. At a young age, I had the good fortune that my parents taught me to love the forests. They would bring us mushroom picking regularly in the Black Forest near our small German town. Whereas my brothers would find the old, tough mushrooms, I had learned the secret to discovering them as they were just peering out from the forest floor when they were still fresh, plump, and delicious. Although today I mostly buy my mushrooms at the grocery store for time and convenience, I have kept my love for the forests. It still harbor a special feeling in the woods. The pure and calm air of the woods soothed me. It made me feel at home. And now, thanks to recent publications, I have a much better understanding of why. I believe that children intuitively understand the language of the forests. But thanks to modern research, the secret language of the trees is being revealed for adults too, allowing us to reconnect and discover the wisdom of nature once more. The author of The Hidden Life of Trees is Peter Wellman. His journey from career forester in Humboldt, Germany to internationally recognized author on ecological themes was sparked by the discovery of an ancient tree stump that was being kept alive by surrounding trees for hundreds of years. When peeling back the thick moss layers that covered what he thought were rocks, he instead discovered that the trunk was being nourished by its neighbors. So he became interested to understand how and why. Thanks to his training, he knew that the stump could not possibly be photosynthesizing its own life-supporting sugars, for it had no leaves. So if surrounding trees were acting in a strictly competitive manner, as he had been taught in school, the sharing of sugars seemed completely illogical. Another pioneering researcher helping to decode the secret language of the trees is Dr. Susan Simard. Her interest in the communication and collaboration of trees was sparked when working for the British Columbia Ministry of Forests, when trying to understand why her reforested plots were generating sickly and dying trees. Having grown up herself in the lush and thriving forests of British Columbia in a family of loggers, she knew something had to be going on, and there must be more to the story. Her curiosity led her to investigate what was happening below the forest floor, to learn about the soils, and to discover what Nature magazine would later coin the Wood Wide Web. Through the interconnection of root systems and fungi, trees and plants in the forests share not only sugars and nitrogen, but it turns out they also share valuable information, such as when to reproduce, the presence of certain predators, and memories essential for keeping the forest healthy and strong. Understanding the forest we see is actually informed by the invisible network of roots, fungi, and soils happening just below the surface struck me as similar to the processes described by psychologists and philosophers as to what happens in a human being in the subconscious and unconscious layers. For trees, the root system is often significantly more expensive than what we can see above ground. And for a human being, this evokes the hidden or inner life, or what we may call the human soul. Understanding that the forest we see is actually informed by the invisible network of roots, fungi, and soils happening just below the surface struck me as similar to the processes described by psychologists and philosophers as to what happens in a human being in the subconscious or unconscious layers. For trees, the root system is often significantly more expansive than what we can see above ground. And for a human being, this evokes the hidden or inner life of the human soul. There are many terms used to talk about the visible and invisible dimensions of the human being, from speaking about an outer or basic self and an inner or higher self, or to speaking about a true and divine essence versus an illusory or materialistic personality. Whereas the terms vary between schools of thought, the basic concept that there are parts of the human being which are external and therefore easily visible, and other parts that are internal and therefore much more difficult to grasp, is a recurring theme across many schools of thought. For a forest, the tree layers above the ground are visible and therefore external, but everything happening below the forest floor is in a way happening in the invisible. And similarly to the human being, what is happening below the surface is equally or maybe even more important than what is happening above ground. In the woods, for example, when the soils are affected by either excessive compaction or a significant change in moisture, the roots become damaged. Although it can take a very long time for the impact of compaction and damage to the roots to be visible above ground, it is only a question of time before the effects are seen above ground and the sickness is visible. One important reason compaction is so detrimental to not only the health of trees, but also to its future growth, is that the soil's capacity to hold air and therefore water is affected. For a tree, water is even more essential than sugar, as it can always photosynthesize more sugar as long as it has water. But without water, the tree will die. So the soils that have been compacted slowly starve the tree unless the roots can locate aerated soil nearby. For a human being, the alchemical symbols of air and water are often associated with emotions. So could understanding the compaction of the forest help us to understand what is happening in the human soul? Although the sources of compaction for a human being may be very different than for the soils, where the heavy machinery used for clear cutting have an obvious effect. But for human beings, it may be more difficult to know what will be soul crushing or traumatizing for one person versus another. But perhaps there are analogies to be made and wisdom to be extracted from the wisdom of nature. We know that when a human being harbors negative and hurtful emotions over long periods, it can take a while before their impact becomes evident. But perhaps like the peering mushrooms of my youth, for the careful observer, there are already signs long before the emotions bubble to the surface or somatize. The term to somatize comes from the Greek word for body, which is soma, and the Greek word for soul, which is psyche, gives us words such as psychology or psychiatry. Putting these two terms together, today doctors speak about psychosomatic illnesses. These are sicknesses that have their origin at the psychological level, so in our feelings and thoughts, but that actually affect the body and result in physical illnesses, which makes them challenging to treat, as their origin is not physiological. It is much easier, for example, to set a splint, take a pill, or apply an ointment, than to try to understand what is happening in a person's inner world. But as the Buddha said, our life is a result of our thoughts of yesterday, and our thoughts of today create our life tomorrow. So gaining insights from nature on how to work in the invisible realms can be very helpful. There are many studies that are revealing the interaction between mind and body and how mindfulness and living with greater intention can help to reduce stress and improve health. Many of these use the breath as part of the centering or slowing down process to help us to focus our mind, steady ourselves, and to ground us. So, is air as important for a healthy human psyche as it is for the roots of trees? What can it mean to bring air into our feelings or to aerate our ideas? Breathing may seem like the easiest thing in the world, but as it turns out, longtime meditators and spiritual teachers will say that breathing correctly can be the practice of a lifetime. Of course, we know how to breathe in a basic sense, just in and out. How hard can that be? But since we know that our breathing gets shallow and quick when we are stressed or afraid, and becomes slow and deep when we are relaxed, there is a wisdom in this simple necessity that has huge implications for health and well being. So, if the importance of air and soils can be a source of reflection and inspiration about health and wellness in human beings, it is interesting to consider what other factors could be essential ingredients for happy and healthy human beings and trees alike. Interestingly, scientists at the Kariga Game Reserve in South Africa showed that not only do trees recognize when they're being aggressed by predators, such as giraffes, they also start to produce tannins to protect themselves as the bitterness repels the munching giants. But their wisdom does not stop at the simple recognition of the attack. They also emit ethylene into the air to warn their neighbors of the danger, which tells their upstream neighbors to also start producing tannins to protect themselves. So not only do trees share resources, but they also communicate and support each other. And with every passing year, scientists are finding more and more ways that trees collaborate. So the view of trees as isolated, unconscious loners that are strictly in competition is fading more and more, to be replaced by a view of them as social organisms that not only live together, but also are interacting populations. For trees, social behavior seems to be mutually beneficial. One of the most important benefits might be that this collaboration is what makes old growth forests to be healthier and more productive in the long term than the monoculture trees being cultivated today. Tree farms often achieve short-term profits at the expense of soil erosion and long-term fragility of the woods. As for human beings, recent research is showing that social connections have a profound influence on the health and well-beings of individuals. Loneliness and isolation are not only correlated with higher risks of mortality, but are also known to negatively affect mental health, depression, and anxiety, as well as to be associated with higher rates of cardiovascular impairment, chronic pain, and fatigue. Could trees over the millions of years of evolution have learned that we weather better together? Are the natural cycles of nature affecting human beings and human families in ways similar to trees and forests? The human psyche, for example, tends to have ups and downs just because. For example, sometimes we feel in a good mood and sometimes in a bad mood. Sometimes we feel like it and sometimes we don't. But does our mood need to dictate our behavior? By the same token, sometimes we feel strong enough to support ourselves and maybe even a few people around us. But other times, we feel like any small thing can overwhelm us or crush our spirit. At times, we are courageous, and other times, we feel too insecure to leave our house or to open our mouths. Maybe our inner state follows similar ups and downs, similar to the in and out cycle of our breath. Perhaps true wisdom means developing the ability to be generous and courageous when we feel an abundance of strength, and developing the ability for humility and acceptance when we are experiencing moments of vulnerability. Trees naturally have the ability to alternate between moments of giving and receiving, which in the end makes them stronger. Perhaps in nature, everything must participate in this natural cycle of in and out, give and take. Trees naturally have the ability to alternate between moments of giving and receiving, which in the end makes them stronger. Perhaps in nature, everything must participate in this natural rhythm to some degree. And our wisdom is in finding out how, developing the humility to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. An essential ingredient for health must certainly include the wisdom to know when is a time to rest and when is a time for action, when is a time for words and when is a time for silence. Nature has her rhythms, and learning to recognize the spring from the fall or the summer from the winter can be important, as there are times for things in life. Perhaps the cycles of give and take, sowing and reaping, are as natural as breathing in and breathing out, albeit at very different rhythms and over different durations of time for a tree versus an individual. And precisely, perhaps it is this rhythm or pace of the forest that is so slow, which makes it difficult for us to extract its wisdom. And rhythm or pace is precisely one thing that makes understanding the wisdom of the forest so challenging, as everything takes so much longer in the woods. So we may not perceive the changes, but if you have ever watched a time-lapse video of a seed that is sprouting or flowers as they open, you will see that there is really so much more going on than we perceive because we go too fast and often lack patience. But perhaps it is precisely because forests take their time that we find them to be areas that allow us to be still and to resource ourselves. Maybe we can all benefit from slowing down a little bit and experience calm and centeredness, at least for a little while. Another interesting example of rhythm and pacing given in the hidden life of trees is related to how certain trees coordinate their reproductive cycles, collaborating to create lean and abundant years. This is an intelligent way for trees to keep predator populations in check in order to favor the survival of a few of their own seeds for reproduction in years of abundance. Making seeds every year would allow herbivore populations to grow unbounded, whereas having lean years ensures that some tree fruits will not be completely consumed as a balance is maintained. This reproduction strategy highlights a wisdom not only in pacing, but also in restraint. For human beings, being able to plan ahead and practice restraint can be challenging as the calls for immediate gratification and constant excitement abound, making the delay of gratification something many struggle with, despite the detrimental consequences of acting impulsively. A subsequent advantage for this coordination of seed production is to maximize genetic diversity, promoting better health for all. Without biodiversity, one pest or environmental change can decimate an entire tree population. Moreover, the mixing of genetic materials favors the evolution of new variations, which allow trees and forests to respond to environmental changes, ensuring their survival over the long term. Whereas we speak about biodiversity in nature as an essential ingredient to keeping forests strong and healthy, what can be a parallel for human collectives? Are we not benefited by the mixing of ideas, cultures, and traditions? Is our human family not enriched by our differences and stronger thanks to them? Surely, we have all had the experience of how a group has allowed us to solve problems and achieve things we could never have done alone. This Earth Day, I hope you will have the opportunity to explore and discover some of the amazing living beings with whom you share your neighborhoods and be enriched and benefited by them.